Hello lovely people, I'm K3N and welcome to my channel. In this video I want to share a little bit of footage of the work of an artist called Amy Pabst, who I saw at the Festival of Quilts in Birmingham last week. So I've got a minute or so of video of some of her work, and I'll show you that now, and then we'll come back and we'll make a pineapple log cabin block, wonky style. Amy's very accurate and precise and tiny and beautiful. We're going to do it hand sewn and very wonky. So enjoy the video and then we'll be back. This first piece is called Bloom and it is 3,254 pieces. There are 42 blocks in total, and as you can see it's based on the pineapple block. It's absolutely beautiful, the texture in it of all those little folds. Each strip ends up less than 3 millimeters wide. I'm pulling back so that you can get an overall look at it. The overall piece is 25 centimeters by 31. This was a larger piece. It's had 31,308 pieces, all made from sari silk. The blocks are pieced, you see, with the cream square as the center, and then when you put them together you get the cross shape. That's formed as it. And here's my finger coming in to give you an idea of the scale. My fingertip covers one of those colourful squares. It was stunning in person. The sari silk just absolutely gleamed. I'm going to give you an angle-y shot just to give you an idea of the beauty of it. The lighting wasn't great, I have to say. Whoops, a bit blurry, sorry about that. Then I went inside the space and there were a lot of people, so I only caught two. This one's called Shade. It was all beautiful shades of indigo. Again, a large piece, and the one next to it is called Ghosted, and from the far away it looked like it was cream, but when you zoomed in you can see, zoom in Catherine, here I go, that it's actually all different very pale colours. Focus pocus, there we go. Again, absolutely stunning. So I'll put a link to the Festival of Quilts section on Amy, and then you can from there find more about her. There you see 8,268 pieces. Wonderful work, absolutely wonderful. So yeah, do go and check Amy out. She's also on Instagram. Okay, so that is, you know, the work was absolutely amazing. The pineapple block, as you saw in the video, and I think I mentioned, the pattern's created when you put at least 4 blocks together. So I'm going to just make one block, but then if you want to go on and make more blocks, then as you put them together you'll see that cross shape evolving, appearing. What's the word? It's very early. My words haven't woken up yet apparently. Anyway, so what you'll need is a piece for the centre square. I'm working, now all this I've just torn by eye. My strips are super wonky, not remotely the same size. So you need some dark strips, some light strips. The light and dark contrast, as with most log cabins, is the important thing. So I've got this dark grey and this pale pink, and a red square for the centre. Just for guidance, I will tell you that my square for the centre is 1¼ inches, and my strips, I'm measuring away because my ruler's glary. My strips are a generous inch-ish. Okay, and then you'll need some cotton for piecing and some scissors and a needle, and that's it. We're not going to piece this onto a foundation, which is the opposite of what Amy does, because I think it's easier, the trimming and so on, to do it with, you know, when we're doing it with scissors, because not everybody has the rotary cutters and everything, to not have the foundation in the way. So we're going to just piece in mid-air. So just going to start with the square, and then we're going to sew 2 darks, 2 opposite sides. Now every round of this block has 8 logs, but you piece the darks and then the lights. It'll become obvious as it goes along to make the 8. So we're going to start by stitching a strip to 2 opposite sides. I always like to cut them a little bit longer than what I'm sewing them to for the trimming, so maybe a good ½ inch longer. Do you see? So it sticks out 1/4 inch each side. This is all by eye, I'm not measuring, we're wonky here. You could also just sew the strip on and trim it afterwards, but for some reason I'm trimming them in advance. Got a knot in my thread. So now I'm just going to, if you've got a right side to your cloth, right sides together, have it sticking out sort of an even distance-ish either side, you see? When I say even, I'm using the term very loosely. And then I'm going to just stitch a 1/4 inch-ish seam just along that side. Just a little running stitch somewhere in the region of 1/4 inch. Until I get to the other side. Now you have to stop and start your thread because you know, you're stitching opposite sides. So I'll just do a little back stitch. Don't worry too much because I'm going to stitch across that seam in a bit. So just one little back stitch and then flip it up like that and just finger press. If you need to go and iron, you know you're allowed, but I'm not gonna. And then turn it round and do the same thing on the opposite side. So again, right sides together if there is a right side to your cloth. Check that your overlap is more or less, you know, a bit each side. I haven't even put a knot in my thread, I'm just going to do a little back stitch, I won't pull it right through. And away I go again. That red cloth is quite a high thread count, it came out of the scraps that my friend gave me. I did a video last Friday, if you haven't seen it, with me sorting through this big shoebox full of scraps that she gave me, and explained that she works differently to me. She works primarily by machine, so she likes cloth with a high thread count. But it's such a beautiful colour, I had to use it. And snip again, flip it up. So you see I'm holding that seam with these two fingers and flipping that grey piece up and then finger pressing that between my fingers and my thumbs. So when you look on the back you'll see that the seams are going towards the grey. Do you see that? So then we're going to turn it through 90 degrees and we're going to do exactly the same thing here and here. So this time you see that the greys need to be longer. And this time they don't need to stick out. I'm just thinking, do they? No, they don't need to stick out. They only need to be the same length as the piece you've just sewn. So my piece is, this is, do you see? Can that still work? Yeah, probably. I think I'll get away with that. We'll see. We'll see what happens. It's only cloth. So I'm now going to match it to the red square, not up here, to the red square, and then I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along that line, ish. When I say a 1/4 inch seam, you know, somewhere in shouting distance of a 1/4 inch is fine for Wonky. In fact, everything's fine for Wonky. Start with the back stitch. Now when I come to the seam allowance, you've heard me say before, if you've been here a while, that not to sew through them. That seam allowance is staying there for, you know, forever and a day. So I can sew through it if I want to. So if it's comfortable to stitch through it, you stitch through it. It's not like when we make the 4 patches and we have to fiddle about with the seam allowances and you want them flapping free. Just do whatever, you know, if it feels too thick to stitch through, then don't stitch through it. If it's easier to just stitch straight along, stitch straight along. So that's that end. One little back stitch and trim. And the same thing again, I'm not going to trim that now, I'm going to trim that later. So I'm holding it between my 2 fingers and then pushing up with my thumbs and finger pressing. And I can see my stitching there because I've used light thread, but it doesn't matter, to me anyway. Turn it round, use this piece that I probably shouldn't be using. We'll see what happens. Match it again with the red, don't match it here. And again, I'll just stitch along there. Back stitch to start. all the way to the other side. I actually spoke to Amy because I asked her permission to share the video, and she was demonstrating, or she didn't have, she sews on a sewing machine, but she didn't have that with her. She had some samples that she was sharing, and she was showing the little foundation blocks that she uses, and it's a kind of, it's not, when you foundation piece, the traditional way is to do it onto a paper template, by machine with your stitches very close together. I did a lot of it at one point, and at some time I will show you some of the things that I made. I did a lot of what's called twisted log cabin. If I can come up with a way to do it wonky and by hand, I will. So you stitch onto your paper template from the back, so you stitch on the paper side, and then you tear the paper out when you're done. It's quite a challenging process when you first start doing it, because you're stitching from the back all the time, and but it's the traditional, or it's the received way to get accurate, very pointy points, and you see all those tiny pieces that Amy works with, all super accurate. So I'm just going to trim that off, that strip, and I'm going to press these seams in the same way, fingers behind, thumbs up, and there you see I've just got a little square surrounded by a frame. But now what I want to do is turn that square so it's on point, like that. And then my next strips I'm going to sew on these 4 sides, but they're not sides, they're points, so I need to trim them. Now the way to do it with a rotary cutter, I'll just show you in case you want to do it that way. Glary ruler coming in, I apologise, would be to find a 1/4 inch line on your ruler, and then lay it over the block. I'll try and do it in the air at an angle. Lay it over the block like that, and then line up that 1/4 inch with the point of that red square. Do you see that? And make sure that's on a 45, you do it here where you've got your 45-degree angle. Make sure you're under that 45-degree angle, and then cut that point off. We're not going to do it like that. We're going to get a pair of scissors and do it by eye. But it's just in case, you know, some of you want to be super accurate. So if you want to make sure your line is straight, you could get a ruler, and I would then do it that way up, and then look there for about a 1/4 inch, and draw yourself a line. Perhaps I'll do that. Sorry for the glaring if it's glaring. Otherwise, if you're confident and you've got a big pair of sharp scissors, you can just go snip straight across. I'm just eyeballing and drawing a line. I'm going to do that on the first one, and after that I'm going to do it by eye. I'm going to get my bigger scissors, I think, because it's easier to cut a longer length straight with bigger scissors. And I'm just going to cut straightish all through the seams and everything, like that, and that goes in the scraps. And then I'm going to turn it to this corner, and I'm aiming for it to end up vaguely square. So I'm going to cut here now, making sure I leave a bit here for the seam. It's only this first round where you have to worry about leaving that bit for the seam. After that you don't. And just cut that off, and then turn it again. Now bear in mind we're Wonky Wednesday, so if you end up with something that's not entirely square, and your bits you've left for the seam are all different, and so on, it doesn't matter. It does make scraps, these little tiny scraps, but we all know we're going to use them, so they were scraps to start with as well. There we go. So now I've got this little square left, and you see it on the back. So now I'm going to stitch some light strips to this square in exactly the same way. So here's my light pink. And again, I like to make sure it sticks out a little bit at the edges. I'd rather, you know, leave a bit. So if you lay it on that way up, and if you want to trim it first, just make sure it's sticking out 1/4 inch or so each side. Those are not as sharp as the snippies. And then when you sew this seam, if you're worried about accuracy, where you stitch is, you make sure you go through that point there where your other two seam lines met, do you see? Otherwise you don't worry and you just stitch and see where it's, you know, see what happens. I'm going to do the latter, stitch and see what happens. This pink is very, very thick, not thick, dense Egyptian cotton, a dense weave. And actually it was a mask, it was a COVID mask, which I've recently washed, and I found them in a box. Washed and retrieved the cloth from them. It can be a little bit thick to get through the seams. I'm going to do a back stitch there because I did quite a big stitch. If that happens, you know, if your running stitch comes up big because you've been shoved along a bit by the seam allowance, just take another little back stitch. Just paying attention to what you're doing and thinking of ways to correct things that go maybe not entirely according to plan. Whoops, like that. The thread's getting super short as well. There we go. I think I got just enough thread to do the other side as well. Snip that off. Same pressing. It's the same pressing all the time, so fingers behind the seam, push up with your thumbs. And you see there my point is, so the point of that square is pointy. But again, if it doesn't worry you, don't worry about it. So I'll get another bit, cut it about 1/4 of an inch each side longer, and stitch that on there. Yeah, I think I can't remember if I said in the video, but Amy is in her 30s. And I'm always very, very happy to see younger people doing fibre crafts, you know, textile art we call it in the UK. I think you call it fibre art across the pond, or you know, anything with stitching, or and younger people who look at something traditional and put their own spin on it and do it well. And Amy teaches and gives talks, and I think she's a certified quilt judge as well. You know, it's keeping everything alive, isn't it? It's keeping it going forward into the next generation. Right, I do now need to get more thread because that's too tiny, even for me. So I'll just press that up. So I've got that. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing again on the opposite sides once I've got new thread. This vintage thread's getting towards the end. But it's kind of, as I've been unwinding it, there's something written on the card. It's a cardboard core. Can you see? It'll say Dewhursts and something behind there. So it's gradually being revealed as the thread's coming off. I'll be keeping that little spool. Right, I need more of this. So same thing again. Now this time again you don't need to worry about having overlap. You only need the overlap here in the, you know, at this, what's going to be this point here, because of when you trim. I hope that is clear. If you're worried, then just leave little overlaps everywhere and then you're sure if it's not clear. You could of course make this scrappy. You don't have to use you know, the same colours. You could just sort your lights and darks. And get another colour for your middle. I mean, red's traditional, but it doesn't have to be, of course. So that would be a good way to use, as with all log cabins, you know, you can use lights and darks. In fact, they look really good scrappy. So So I'm just stitching along till I get to the other side. I didn't mention, do choose fine cloth, you know, like just cotton, thin, fine cotton, because of all the seams. This high thread count is not nice, but I wanted to use it up. Well, you know, it's nice. I mean, it's not nice, not nice to hand stitch. And there you, oh, you could, if you wanted to, of course, put pins. You see how I'm going uphill a bit there, I'll just adjust it back downhill. Oh, there goes the fridge again. I mentioned in Monday's video about the fridge, and I wasn't sure at that point if the microphone picked it up, and I now know that it does. That is the fridge. It's not my tummy rumbling, although I have not had my breakfast yet. That's funny. I don't know if it's a very good sign for the fridge, actually, that it's, I don't think it should be making noises like that, but anyway. Cut that off, trim that, and flip. And do the other side. Sorry, I was listening to the fridge. Oh dear. Oh dear, dear, dear. Right, back stitch. For some reason I'm not putting knots in. Oops. I'm doing that now. Oh, I'm trying to remember his name. Amy showed the foundation cloth stuff that she used. I think it was some kind of polyester. I'm not sure. I don't know, actually. I should look it up. They were pre-printed little, tiny little square foundation squares that she then stitched the little strips onto. And she puts the strips on slightly wider and then trims the seam allowance back to less than 1/8 of an inch, she said. Less than 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Because the little strip itself that's left showing when she's done the piecing is 3mm, which is about 1/8 of an inch, is it? I don't know. Small. It's very, very small. Why it's called micro-piecing. And it's just mind-blowing that all those little quilts, because they're all little. The bigger one that I showed you with the sari silks, that was the biggest, I think, that was there. But 250,000 pieces, and it's just mind-blowing. It wouldn't be for me to do it, but I did think they were absolutely stunning. But yeah, she's found her thing. That's her thing. She's enjoying herself and sharing it with the world. Little back stitch. Cut that off. Cut that off. So that's, put my fingers behind, press the seam up. Now that's my first round. So I need to do the same thing again. Trim it square in a square. And again, I need to leave the seam allowance because this, it looks like 2 rounds, but this is counted as the first round. So a round of darks and a round of lights is 1 round. So I'm going to just trim again by eye, leaving about 1/4 of an inch showing between that point and where I'm cutting. And then again. And again. And again. Oh, it's really hard to cut with these scissors. I'm not the best. I've not got my big fiskers here with me. There we go. So now we repeat. The process of stitching is exactly the same, but the trimming is slightly different. So I'm going to do some darks, and now you can line up with the outside edge. You don't need to leave extra unless you want to, because it makes you feel happier. So now I'm just going to stitch that strip on again, right sides together, 1/4 inch-ish seam. I wonder how many times one says that when one's teaching. Well, I used to teach this kind of thing by machine. And I go to workshops with bags full of rotary cutters and mats and rulers and equipment. When I went over to teaching slow stitch, I took much less stuff with me. It was lovely. Just one little bag. Often some fabric scraps to share, and spare needles and threads and scissors and so on in case people didn't have, but not the huge great big bags full of stuff that I took when I was teaching the machine sewing, and a spare machine in case somebody's machine packed up. Oh my goodness, much easier by hand. Oh, what's happened there? It's gone all curly. Oops. Now I've got a knot. Still. Excuse me while I sort out my knot. What's happened? Oh, it's one of those knots. You get those sometimes where your tail gets knotted around your working thread. And then what I do is I just establish that that is indeed my tail by seeing, or does it slide up and down the thread? Yes, it does. So what I'm holding in my left hand is definitely my thread tail. And I get all that out of the way, and then I cut very close to the knot. Sometimes it goes horribly wrong and I cut my thread. So if ever that happens to you, and then if you get hold of that little tail, it should just pull off. I don't know why that happens, probably because my thread gets twisted and I'm not paying attention, and because I've got too long a thread. Back stitch and trim that off and trim that off. Press it and then again to the opposite side. Oops. So I'll finish sewing these 4 darks on, and then I'll come back and show you the trimming. Okay, so that's my dark round done. So from now on the trimming is dictated by the width of the logs. So if you wanted all your logs to be the same width, if I lay this ruler on, this glary horrid ruler, I'll try and hold it in the air again so it doesn't glare. So I need to trim off the point here. So if I line the ruler up underneath on the edge of this, what you can see is your straight edge where you trimmed before. Do you see? So if I had 3/4 inch wide logs, that would be where I would trim, and then I'll keep that consistent throughout. I cut 1 inch wide, I tore 1 inch wide strips, so I should have 3/4 inch left because I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance to go out, okay? So if you want to be accurate and worry about numbers, then this next log will be the finished size of your strip plus a 1/4 inch. But we're not going to be, well, I'm not going to be accurate, but some of you might want to be. I'm just going to cut it. So I'm going to, by eye, line it up with that line there, and make sure it's roughly parallel, and I'm going to cut it somewhere near that point. I'm no longer worrying about seam allowances because our logs from here on out will not have points on them anymore. They'll be like that, you see, with the points cut off, and that gives the pineapple effect. So I'm just going to cut it about there, if Amy ever watches this, she will probably have a fit. I'm sure she wouldn't have a fit. She would just accept that this is our way, and her way is different. So again, here I'm lining up with, well, you know, lining up with something wonky. I'm going to get something wonky. But I'm aiming to end up with a square. Now you see here, when I'm cutting here, there's not going to be a point anymore. That doesn't matter either. So just cut it, dear Henry, because when we've got the size we want, what I'm then going to do is put it onto a foundation square and fill in the corners. And that will give me something that ends up a certain size, so that if I want to make several and sew them together, they'll all be the same size within the bounds of their foundation square. But you know, the basic principle is you just keep making squares on point, and then you keep cutting off the corners and then sewing on another round. So now I'm going to sew on a pink round in exactly the same way. So I'll go away and do that, and then I'll be back again when I've done that. Okay, so I've sewed on my other pink round and I trimmed it in exactly the same way. So now I've got this rather wonky little square. And now here I want to put this in my journal, so I've got a foundation square, just a thin bit of sheet that is just about 4 inches square. So I'm going to put this on here, on point again, and it just about fits, roughly central. And I might need to put some pins in it, because it's very flippy floppy, because of course I haven't ironed it actually. Put a pin up. If I put a pin in these points, then, and then I'm going to fill in the corners. Now when you fill in the corners, if you were going to make several and join them together, those 4 corners would meet, because they're triangles, so they would meet to form a square. So if you made all those corners, say in one colour, say you made them in black, for example, then you'd end up with little black squares in between all your blocks. If you go and study Amy's work, you'll see that that is what she does. You know, she has a, I'm not explaining it very well. She has a particular theme for these 4, and your eye's drawn to that. Your eye's not necessarily drawn to the centre of each block. Your eye is drawn to the junction between the 4 blocks. I hope that makes sense. And that's what is known as secondary patterns. So you have the pattern within a block, and then when you put the blocks together you get what's called a secondary pattern. And that endlessly fascinates me, that idea of secondary patterns. And did endlessly fascinate me when I was a normal quilter. Right, so I've got these bits of dark grey, random shape bits out of the scraps. All I'm going to do is lay that on that corner, make sure it's big enough. Yes it is, I can maybe even get away with going closer to the edge. Well, I get away with doing it that way even. So you can just audition and make sure you cover. You see there I don't cover, so that's not big enough. I'm going to have to do it that way. Instead of fiddling about trying to get a triangle that's exactly the right size, just audition it, fold it back as if it had a seam. And you see, I can see that that's big enough there, and obviously it's plenty big enough there, and it's big enough that way. So I'm just going to lay that on there like that. And maybe put a pin. And get my thread and just stitch that through all the layers onto the foundation. So in one fell swoop, as they say, I'm stitching my piece to my foundation cloth, and I'm filling in my corners. Oops, don't put it too tight. So I'm going to go away and, I'll show you the trimming of this one first, and then I'll go away and do the other 4 corners, and I'll show you it at the end. Let me just finish this seam and show you the trimming. Well, it's pretty straightforward, and we've done it before, but still. Some of you may be new here. Oh, that pin's in the way now. Get that pin out of the way. There we go. So I'll just take a back stitch to finish. trim that off. And I'll press that up in exactly the same way as before. When I was pressing against my fingers, that was when it was tiny. When it gets bigger, you need to be on a surface really. So I'll just fold that up, finger press that seam down, and then I can turn it over to the back. And if you're unsure that it's going to stay in place, you could just put a pin somewhere in the middle. And then I'll turn it to the back and I'll just trim it all off level with the edges of that foundation. Level-ish. With these not very sharp scissors. There we go. So that's that corner filled in. So I'll go and do that with the other 3 corners, and then I'll be back and show you how it looks at the end. Okay, so I've finished the 4 corners and I've stitched a line of running stitch around the edge just to hold them down. I've left that unstitched because I'm going to use that side to stitch it into my journal. I remembered to stop. I just wanted to quickly show you this because I showed a picture I think in last week's video, but I don't think I showed you on video. So I stitched the circle with blanket stitch and then I whipped the blanket stitch with the red. I did some seed stitch in the middle and then I did the surface blanket stitch radiating out, threading through the leg. In Comfort Cloth Week in the Monday project we used that stitch. If you don't know how to do it, if you look in the slow stitch project playlist and look for Comfort Cloth, you'll find that. And then I did some stem stitch coming out to make the radiating lines over my grid. I was very happy with that. Onto this page. I'm not going to do any more stitching on it because the cloth is not very nice to stitch through. The pink, which was actually my cloth that I'd had since I don't know when. But like I said, I'd used for masks because it was such a high thread count. So I'm just going to stitch it onto the page. And just say that I hope you enjoyed that. And that you'll have a go and that maybe you'll make 4 and put them together and look for the secondary effect. I absolutely take my hat off to Amy, and she was an absolutely charming woman, so sharing of her knowledge with the people that were all gathered around her. And it was lovely to have a very brief chat with her because there are a lot of people wanting her attention. And it was absolutely wonderful to see log cabins done in a well, like I said, foundation piecing's nothing new. Log cabins are certainly nothing new. The pineapple block is a traditional one, but to see it done in that way was very, I liked it very much, you know. Just because it's not something that draws us to want to do it doesn't mean we can't admire it when we see other people doing it. Okay, that's that stitched in. So I just need to finish that off and say, if you enjoyed this video, please give me the thumbs up. It really helps my channel grow. Something to do with algorithms and things I don't completely understand, but all I know is that if you enjoyed it, it's really important that you press that thumbs up button, and please consider subscribing if you haven't already. And thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to you joining me next time for more Cloth Tales. Bye bye.